The transport shuttle shook violently as it descended through the thick atmosphere of Cairo 7. And inside the cargo hold, 7 recruits held onto their safety harnesses with varying degrees of fear and confidence. Sergeant Elena Vasquez sat calmly in her seat, her eyes closed, her breathing steady, while around her the alien recruits made sounds of distress in their native languages that the universal translators struggled to keep up with. She had been through worse drops than this one, and she had learned long ago that panic wasted energy that might be needed later. The shuttle's pilot, a 4-armed Krellian with gray skin and too many eyes, announced through the intercom that they would be landing in approximately 2 minutes and that all recruits should prepare for immediate deployment. Upon touchdown, Elena opened her eyes and looked at her fellow recruits for what felt like the 100th time since they had left the Coalition training station. To her left sat the 2 Morthani, a species of warm-blooded avians from a tropical world called Thesca Prime, and their names were Thesic and Rekka. Thesic was the senior of the 2. Her feathers a brilliant combination of red and gold that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of the cargo hold. And she held herself with the proud bearing of someone who had never truly known hardship. Her companion Rekith was younger and smaller, his feathers more orange than red, and he kept glancing at Thesic as if waiting for instructions on how to feel about this whole situation. Across from Elena sat Vroth, a Cathari from the ocean world of Cathar, and Vroth was perhaps the strangest-looking creature Elena had ever seen. The Cathari was an amphibian with 6 limbs, smooth blue-green skin that glistened with moisture, and large black eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Vroth communicated primarily through chemical signals released from glands along its body, though it could also speak through a specialized translator implant when necessary. The Cathari had not spoken much during the journey, preferring to observe the others with those deep, unreadable eyes. In the back of the shuttle sat the 3 Volluxi, a species of methane breathers who required special environmental suits to survive in oxygen-rich atmospheres. Their names were Tokani, Marish, and Vol, and they looked almost identical in their bulky gray suits with their multiple sensor arrays and life support systems. Elena knew from her briefings that the Volluxi were highly intelligent and excellent engineers, but they were also extremely vulnerable outside of their controlled environments. Their suits had heating units, atmospheric processors, and emergency hibernation protocols. But Elena had noticed during their briefings that those suits were rated for temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius at the lowest. She hoped that would be enough. The shuttle touched down with a heavy thud that rattled Elena's teeth, and immediately the rear cargo door began to open, letting in a blast of frozen air that made several of the recruits cry out in shock. Elena was the first one out of her harness and moving toward the exit, her boots crunching on the metal floor. As she approached the growing rectangle of white light, Kara's V stretched out before her in all its frozen glory, a landscape of ice and snow and howling wind that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The sky above was a pale gray that promised nothing good, and Elena could already feel the cold seeping through her standard issue thermosuit as she stepped down onto the frozen ground behind her. The other recruits were slower to exit, their bodies already reacting poorly to the sudden change in temperature. The 6 feathers had begun to puff up in an automatic response to the cold, making her look almost twice her normal size, while Rekith was shivering so badly that his beak was chattering. Vroth moved slowly and carefully down the ramp, each of its 6 limbs placing themselves with deliberate precision on the icy surface, and Elena could see that the Cathara's skin had already lost some of its healthy sheen. The Volluxi came last, their suits humming loudly as the heating units worked overtime to keep them warm. Drill Commander Vethkan was waiting for them at the base of the ramp, his tall Silurian body covered in scales that seemed to shift between blue and silver in the dim light. The Silurians were a cold-blooded species that could regulate their internal temperature to a remarkable degree, which made Vethkan an ideal choice for overseeing cold weather training exercises. Looked at the 7 recruits with eyes that held no warmth and no mercy. "Welcome to Cairo 7, he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind through his translator. "And welcome to the most difficult 48 hours of your miserable lives." He began to pace in front of them, his clawed feet leaving deep impressions in the snow. "Your mission is simple in concept but brutal in execution. And it is this. You will travel 70 kilometers north to the extraction beacon, and you will do so with only the supplies in your standard survival kits." Elena's hand moved automatically to the pack on her back, mentally cataloging its contents. Emergency rations for 3 days. 4 chemical heating packs, 1 friction igniter, 1 emergency blanket made of reflective polymer, 1 combat knife, 1 water purification tablet set, and 1 basic medical kit. It was not much, but Elena had survived on less. "There will be no rescue," Vethkan continued, "and there will be no exceptions to this rule. So if you fall behind, you will be left behind, and if you die, your body will be collected when the exercise is complete." Desik made a sound of protest that her translator rendered as, "This seems excessively harsh." But Vethkan silenced her with a look. "The Galactic Coalition does not need soldiers who can only function in comfortable conditions," he said, "and the enemies of the Coalition will not wait for you to warm up before they attack. So you will learn to function in discomfort. Or you will learn nothing at all, because you will be dead." He stepped back and gestured toward the northern horizon. "Your time begins now, and I suggest you start moving before the temperature drops further." With that, he turned and walked back toward the shuttle, which was already warming up its engines for departure. Elena watched the shuttle lift off and disappear into the gray sky, leaving the 7 recruits alone on the frozen surface of an alien world. She turned to look at her companions, assessing their conditions with a practiced eye. The Morthani were already struggling, their tropical biology completely unprepared for this level of cold. And Desik's proud bearing had been replaced by a hunched posture that spoke of deep discomfort. Groth stood completely still, conserving energy in the way of its amphibian ancestors. But Elena could see that the Catharis movements had already become slower and more deliberate than they had been on the shuttle. The Veluxi were the most protected by their suits, but even they were showing signs of stress as their heating units worked at maximum capacity. "We need to start moving," Elena said, her voice cutting through the wind, "because standing still will only make us colder, and we have a long way to go." Desik looked at her with something that might have been resentment. "You seem remarkably calm for someone in this situation." "Human." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "Where I come from, we have a season called winter that lasts for months, and I grew up in a place where temperatures like this were just called Tuesday." She started walking north, not waiting to see if the others would follow, because she knew they would. They had no other choice behind her. 6 alien recruits began to move, their bodies already fighting against a cold that Elena knew was only going to get worse. And in the distance, unseen and undetected by any of them, a massive storm system was building on the horizon, carrying with it temperatures that would test the limits of every species present. The 48-hour exercise was about to become something much more dangerous. Elena did not know this yet, but some part of her, some ancient human instinct forged in ice ages and survival against impossible odds, was already beginning to prepare. 6 hours into the march, the storm arrived without warning and without mercy. One moment the sky was gray but calm, and the next moment the world had become a screaming wall of white that reduced visibility to almost nothing and drove the temperature down so fast that Elena could feel it dropping with every breath she took. She had experienced storms before, had survived blizzards in Siberia that would have killed lesser people, but even she had to admit that this was something special. The wind cut through her thermal suit like it was not even there. and the snow that hammered against her face felt more like tiny knives than frozen water behind her. She could hear the other recruits crying out in alarm and confusion, their translators struggling to keep up with the sudden flood of panicked communications. "Everyone stay close," Elena shouted into the wind. "And keep moving forward, because if we stop now, we will freeze in minutes." But even as she said it, she knew that some of her companions were already in serious trouble. Thessic, the proud Morthani with the beautiful red and gold feathers, had collapsed to her knees in the snow, her body shaking so violently that she could not stand. Her feathers, which had puffed up earlier to trap warmth, were now coated in ice that weighed them down and stole heat from her body faster than she could produce it. Reketh was trying to help her up, but his own strength was failing, and his movements had become slow and clumsy as the cold attacked his tropical physiology. "Her core temperature is dropping too fast," Elena said, rushing back to kneel beside the fallen Morthani. "And if we do not get her warm soon, she will die." She pulled out one of her chemical heating packs and cracked it to activate the warming reaction, then pressed it against Thessic's chest where it would do the most good. The Morthani's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Elena with an expression of confused gratitude. "Why?" Thessic asked through chattering beak. "Why are you helping me when you could use that for yourself?" "Because we survive together or we die alone," Elena said. "And I have no intention of dying today." She looked around at the other recruits, assessing the situation with the cold calculation that had kept her alive. Through a dozen impossible situations, Roth had stopped moving entirely, the Cathari's 6 limbs frozen in place as its amphibian biology struggled to cope with temperatures it had never evolved to handle. The chemical glands that allowed Roth to communicate had frozen solid, leaving the creature isolated and unable to express its distress in any way except through its large black eyes, which were now filled with something that looked very much like terror. The 3 Volugsi were huddled together in a tight formation, their suits pressed against each other in an attempt to share what little warmth their heating units could still produce. The leader of the 3 was transmitting urgent messages through her suit's communication system, and Elena's translator picked up fragments of the transmission. "Heating unit at 15% capacity and falling," Tokani was saying. "And emergency protocols suggest initiating hibernation sequence within the next 30 minutes to prevent permanent cellular damage." Elena felt her stomach drop at those words. She knew about the Veluxi hibernation protocol from her briefings, and she knew that it was designed as a last resort for situations where survival was otherwise impossible. The suits would shut down all non-essential systems, lower the occupant's body temperature to near freezing, and put them into a state of suspended animation that could last for days or even weeks. But the protocol was designed for emergencies, not for extended exposure to temperatures like this. And Elena doubted that the suits could maintain hibernation for the full duration of the storm without failing completely. "Tokani," Elena called out, fighting to be heard over the wind, "how long can your suits maintain hibernation in these conditions?" The Veluxi paused in her transmission and turned to look at Elena with the sensor array that served as her species' primary visual organ. "Uncertain," Tokani admitted, "but our estimates suggest no more than 6 hours before heating failure becomes critical. And after that point, cellular damage will begin within minutes." 6 hours. Elena looked up at the sky, at the swirling mass of gray and white that showed no signs of stopping, and she knew that this storm would last much longer than 6 hours. They were all going to die out here unless she did something. "Everyone listen to me," she shouted, gathering the attention of every recruit who was still conscious enough to hear her. "And listen carefully, because I am only going to say this once." She pointed toward a slight depression in the landscape about 50 meters ahead, a place where the ground dipped down and the wind would be slightly less savage. "We are going to that low area, and we are going to stop there, and I am going to build us a shelter. Desik, still shaking despite the heating pack pressed against her chest, looked at Elena like she had lost her mind. Build a shelter, the Morthani repeated. Out of what, human? There is nothing here but ice and snow and death. Elena allowed herself a grim smile. Where I come from, ice and snow are building materials. And death is just another thing to be avoided through clever thinking and hard work. She grabbed Desik under one arm and Rekith under the other, hauling both Morthani to their feet through sheer force of will wrath. She called to the frozen Cathari. I need you to move, and I need you to move now. Because I cannot carry everyone, and I need you to help me with the others. The amphibian's eyes blinked slowly, processing Elena's words through a brain that was struggling to function in the cold. But then something seemed to click into place. Wrath began to move, slowly and painfully. Each step a victory against the freezing death that was trying to claim its body. Together, the small group staggered toward the depression, fighting against a wind that seemed determined to push them back with every step. The Veluxi brought up the rear, their suits straining to keep them alive, their movements becoming more mechanical and less organic. With every passing minute, it took them 20 minutes to cover 50 meters. And by the time they reached the depression, Rekith had collapsed completely and had to be dragged the last 10 meters by Elena alone. She laid him down beside his companion Desik, both Morthani now barely conscious, their feathers frozen into solid masses of ice that made them look like statues rather than living creatures. Wrath had managed to reach the depression under its own power, but the Cathari had immediately stopped moving upon arrival, its body shutting down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to conserve what little energy remained. The Veluxi were in the worst shape of all, their suits now displaying warning lights that Elena did not need a translator to understand. Initiating hibernation protocol, Tokani announced, her voice flat and mechanical through her suit speakers. And I want you to know, human, that it has been an honor serving with you. However, briefly, save your goodbyes, Elena said, already pulling her combat knife from her belt. Because you are not dying today, none of you are dying today. And I am going to make sure of that. Tokani's sensor array focused on the knife in Elena's hand. What are you planning to do with that primitive tool? She asked. Genuine confusion in her translated voice. Elena looked at the knife, then at the ice beneath her feet, then at the storm raging around them. I'm going to do what humans have always done when the universe tries to kill us, she said, dropping to her knees and beginning to carve into the frozen ground. And that is refuse to accept that death is the only option. Behind her, the three Veluxi suits powered down one by one as hibernation took hold, their bodies going rigid as the emergency protocols began their desperate attempt to preserve life. Elena did not look back. She had work to do, and she had very little time to do it. The knife bit into the ice, and Elena began to dig. Elena's hands were bleeding by the time she broke through the first layer of ice, the cold having cracked the skin on her fingers despite the thermal gloves she wore. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because stopping meant death. And death was not something she was willing to accept for herself or for the 6 aliens who were depending on her to save them. The depression in the landscape had given her a slight advantage against the wind. But slight was not enough, and she knew that without heat, without real warmth, everyone in her group would be dead before the storm past her knife scraped against something different beneath the ice, something that was not frozen water or compacted snow. And Elena felt a surge of hope that warmed her more than any heating pack could. She had been watching the landscape during their descent in the shuttle, had noticed the way certain areas seemed to shimmer with a faint blue color that she recognized from her xenogeology briefings. Methane deposits. Kairos V was a frozen world, but it was not a dead world, and beneath its icy surface lay vast reserves of compressed methane gas that had been trapped there for millions of years. The Veluxi breathed methane, which meant that this planet had to have methane somewhere. And Elena had gambled everything on her ability to find it. She carved a careful circle in the ice around the deposit, creating a controlled opening that would allow the gas to escape at a rate she could manage rather than all at once in a deadly explosion. The smell hit her immediately, a sharp chemical odor that made her eyes water and her lungs burn. And she quickly pulled her emergency blanket from her pack and used it to create a small barrier between herself and the escaping gas. Methane was dangerous in high concentrations, but it was also flammable. And flammable was exactly what Elena needed right now. She reached into her pack and pulled out her friction igniter, a simple device that created sparks through mechanical action rather than requiring any power source. It was considered primitive by coalition standards, included in the survival kits more as a joke than as a serious tool. But Elena knew that sometimes primitive was exactly what you needed. She created a small pile of the reflective polymer from her emergency blanket, positioned it near the methane vent but not so close that the initial ignition would be too violent, and began to work the friction igniter with hands that were shaking from cold and exhaustion. Spark after spark flew into the polymer pile without catching, and Elena could feel her hope beginning to fade with each failed attempt behind her. Desik made a weak sound that might have been a question or might have been a death rattle, and Elena forced herself to focus harder. One more try, one more spark. The polymer caught a small flame, barely visible in the howling storm, flickered to life in Elena's hands, and she felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she carefully, so carefully, moved the burning material toward the methane vent. The gas caught with a soft whooshing sound that seemed to push back against the storm itself. And suddenly, there was fire on a world that had not known warmth in 4 billion years. Elena laughed out loud, a sound of pure joy and triumph that startled even her. And she quickly set about controlling her creation before it could get out of hand. She carved channels in the ice to direct the methane flow, used snow to regulate the size of the opening, and positioned chunks of ice around the flame to reflect the heat inward rather than letting it escape into the wind. Within 10 minutes, she had created a stable heat source that was warming the air around it to temperatures that felt almost tropical compared to the frozen hell that surrounded them. She dragged Desik toward the fire first, the Morthane's frozen feathers beginning to steam as the heat reached them, and then went back for Rekith, who was lighter but somehow more difficult to move because his body had gone completely limp. Roth required a different approach, because the Kethari was too heavy for Elena to drag and too frozen to move on its own. So she brought the fire to Vroth. Instead, she carved a secondary channel from the methane deposit, created a small controlled vent near where Vroth lay, and ignited a second flame that began the slow process of thawing the amphibian's frozen joints. The Veluxi were the most complicated problem, because their suits were rigid in hibernation mode and could not be moved without potentially damaging the delicate life support systems inside. Elena solved this by building a ring of fire around all 3 of them, creating a circle of warmth that the suit's sensors would eventually detect and use to help maintain their occupants' body temperatures. It was crude, it was dangerous, and it was exactly the kind of improvised solution that had kept humans alive for thousands of years on a planet that had tried its best to kill them at every opportunity. Was the first to truly wake up, her eyes opening with a clarity that had been absent since the storm began. And she stared at Elena and the flames around her with an expression of complete disbelief. "Fire," the Morthani said, her translator rendering the word with a tone of religious awe. "You made fire on a world of ice. It was not that difficult," Elena said, even though her bleeding hands and exhausted body told a different story, because fire is just a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions do not care what planet they are on. Rekith stirred next, his smaller body having warmed faster than his companions, and he immediately moved closer to Thesic in the bonding behavior that Elena had learned was common among Morthani, who had shared traumatic experience. Froth took longer to thaw. The amphibian's cold-blooded physiology requiring more sustained heat to bring its body temperature back to functional levels. But eventually, the Kethary's chemical glands unfroze enough to release a scent that Elena's translator interpreted as a single word: gratitude. Elena nodded at the amphibian and turned her attention back to the fire, feeding it carefully with controlled bursts of methane to keep it burning at a steady rate. The storm still raged around them. The wind still howled like a living thing trying to tear them apart, but inside their small circle of warmth, life was returning to creatures who had been moments away from death. "I do not understand," Thesic said, watching Elena work with something approaching reverence. "How you can remain so calm, how you can think so clearly, when everything around us is chaos and death." Elena considered the question as she adjusted the methane flow. "My species evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill us," she said, repeating what she had told them earlier, but with more detail now that they were alive enough to actually listen. "And we survived not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most resistant to cold, but because we learned to think our way out of problems that should have been impossible to solve." She gestured at the fire burning before them. Every human carries thousands of years of survival knowledge in their head, passed down from generation to generation, from the first ancestors who discovered that fire could be controlled to the explorers who learned to build shelters in the most hostile environments on our world. Rekith made a sound that his translator rendered as confusion. "Your world has hostile environments like this." Elena smiled grimly. "My world has deserts, where the temperature can reach 60 degrees Celsius in the day and drop below freezing at night. And it has polar regions where temperatures stay below -50 for months at a time. And it has oceans that will crush you with pressure if you go too deep, and mountains that will suffocate you with thin air if you go too high." She met the Morthani's eyes with a look that contained something ancient and fierce. "Earth tried to kill us in every way a planet can try to kill its children. And we survived all of it. And we did not just survive, but we thrived. And that is why I am not afraid of this storm or this planet or any challenge the universe wants to throw at me." The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere inside their hibernation suits, the Veloxi's life signs began to stabilize. Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before turning her attention to the next problem. Fire was not enough. They needed shelter, and Elena was going to build one. The fire had bought them time, but time was not the same as safety. And Elena knew that the methane deposit would not last forever. She needed to build something more permanent, something that would protect them from the storm even after the fuel ran out. And she needed to do it quickly because her own body was beginning to fail despite the warmth of the flames. Her grandmother had taught her how to build an igloo when Elena was 7 years old, during a winter so harsh that even the adults in their Siberian village had spoken of it with fear in their voices. The old woman had taken young Elena out into the frozen wilderness and shown her how to cut blocks of snow with a knife, how to arrange them in a spiral pattern that created a dome without any need for supports, and how to pack the cracks between blocks with loose snow that would freeze into a solid seal. "The cold is not your enemy," her grandmother had said, "because the cold is just energy that wants to move from warm places to cold places. And if you are clever, you can use the cold itself to protect you from the cold." Elena had never forgotten those words. And now, on an alien world billions of kilometers from her grandmother's grave, she put those lessons into practice. She began cutting blocks of compacted snow from the area around their camp, using her knife with movements that were slow and careful despite the urgency she felt each Block needed to be the right size and shape to fit with the others. And rushing would only mean having to start over from the beginning. Sick. Watched her work for several minutes before speaking. What are you doing? Human. Building us a house. Elena said without stopping her cutting. Out of snow. Out of snow. The Morthani made a sound that her translator could not quite render. Something between disbelief and resignation on my world. We build houses out of woven plant fibers and dried mud. And the idea of building anything out of frozen water seems completely insane. Elena finished cutting her first block and set it in place at the edge of their camp. On my world, people who lived in frozen places learned thousands of years ago that snow is actually an excellent insulator because it is full of tiny air pockets that trap warmth and prevent it from escaping. She cut another block and placed it next to the first one, angling it slightly inward. A properly built snow shelter can be 40 or 50 degrees warmer inside than outside. Even without any heat source at all, Reketh had recovered enough to stand. And he moved to watch Elena more closely. Can I help? He asked. His translator rendering his words with a note of uncertainty. Elena looked at him, at his thin avian limbs and his feathers that were still damp from melting ice. And she made a quick decision. You and Desek gather loose snow and pack it into the gaps between the blocks I place. And make sure you pack it tight, because any gaps will let in cold air. The two Morthani nodded and began their assigned task, moving slowly but steadily as their bodies continued to warm from the fire. Vroth had recovered enough to move again. And the Cathari approached Elena with chemical signals that expressed a desire to assist. Your limbs are stronger than mine, Elena said, pointing to a larger deposit of compacted snow nearby. So I need you to break apart that deposit and bring me pieces that I can cut into blocks. The amphibian's 6 limbs proved to be perfectly suited for this task. And soon a steady supply of raw material was flowing to Elena's workstation. The Volluxi were still in hibernation, their suits still rigid and unmoving, but Elena had a plan for them as well. Help me move them, she said to Vroth, because I made them to be part of the structure, together. The human and the Cathari repositioned the 3 hibernating Volluxi so that they formed a rough triangle at the center of the growing shelter. The rigid suits would serve as structural supports, holding up the roof when Elena reached that stage of construction. And the Volluxi themselves would benefit from being at the center of the warmest part of the shelter. It took 3 hours to build the walls. 3 hours of cutting and placing and packing and adjusting. 3 hours of working in a frozen hellscape, while a storm tried its best to undo everything Elena was creating by the time she started on the roof. Her hands had stopped bleeding because the blood had frozen in the wounds, and her arms felt like they were made of lead rather than muscle and bone. But she did not stop. She could not stop. The roof was the hardest part, because each block had to be angled precisely to lean against the blocks beside it without falling inward. And any mistake could cause the whole structure to collapse. Elena worked from memory, from lessons learned as a child, from knowledge that had been passed down through countless generations of humans who had lived and died in frozen places. She thought about her grandmother as she placed each block, remembering the old woman's weathered hands and her eyes that held wisdom, earned through decades of survival in harsh conditions. She thought about all the humans who had come before her, the ancestors who had crossed frozen continents and survived ice ages and refused to die even when the world itself seemed determined to kill them. She thought about what it meant to be human, to be part of a species that had never accepted the limits that nature tried to impose on it. The last block clicked into place just as the methane deposit finally ran dry and the fire began to die. Elena crawled into the shelter through the entrance tunnel she had built, a curved passage that would trap warm air inside while keeping cold air from flowing in. And she collapsed onto the floor beside the hibernating Veloxifesic, and Reketh followed her inside, their bodies pressed together in the Morthani bonding stance. And Vroth squeezed through the entrance last. the Catharis bulk barely fitting through the narrow opening inside the shelter, protected from the wind. The temperature was already climbing. Elena could feel the warmth returning to her extremities, could feel her frozen blood beginning to flow again. And she allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. "Human," Desek said softly. "Elena, this is remarkable, this structure you have built. It is warmer in here than anywhere I have been since we landed on this terrible world." Elena opened her eyes and looked around at her creation, at the dome of snow blocks that curved above them, at the packed snow walls that sealed out the storm, at the 6 alien lives that she had saved through nothing more than knowledge and determination. "This is called an igloo," she said, "and my people have been building them for thousands of years." Rekus shook his head in wonder. "Your species is remarkable, Elena Vasquez, and I am beginning to understand why the Coalition was so eager to include humans in their training programs." Roth released a chemical signal that Elena's translator interpreted as a complex mixture of respect and curiosity in something that might have been fear. "Your species shapes the environment to serve you rather than trying to survive within the environment as it exists," the Ketheri said through its vocal translator. "And this is a fundamentally different approach than any other species I have encountered." Elena nodded slowly, exhaustion making it difficult to form words. "We call it adaptation, but that is not quite the right word, because adaptation usually means changing yourself to fit your environment. And humans do something different." She gestured at the walls around them. "We change our environment to fit us. And we have been doing it for so long that we have forgotten it. It is unusual that other species might find it strange or frightening." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the igloo, warmth and safety had been created from nothing but snow and human stubbornness. Elena felt herself beginning to drift toward sleep, her body demanding rest after the incredible effort of the past few hours. And she did not fight it. They were safe now. They would survive, and when the storm passed, they would complete their mission and show the Coalition exactly what humans were capable of. As she fell asleep, surrounded by aliens who owed her their lives, Elena dreamed of her grandmother's village in Siberia, of snow-covered roofs and smoking chimneys, and the knowledge that no matter how cold the world became, humans would find a way to make it warm again. The storm lasted for 36 hours, and during that time, 7 recruits lived inside a dome of snow while the universe did its best to kill them. Elena woke periodically to check on the others, to adjust the shelter's ventilation, and to make sure that everyone was still breathing. The Volokci came out of hibernation at hour 24, their suits having detected the warmer temperature inside the igloo and determined that emergency protocols were no longer necessary. Takani was the first to fully wake, her sensor array scanning the interior of the shelter with what Elena could only describe as mechanical astonishment. "This structure," the Volokci said, her translator rendering her words with unusual emphasis. "This structure is maintaining an internal temperature of -5 degrees Celsius while external conditions are -93 degrees. And you built it out of frozen water." Elena shrugged from her position against the wall, where she had been conserving energy while the storm raged outside. "Snow is a good insulator, and the dome shape distributes pressure evenly across the structure. So it is actually quite stable despite what you might think." Marish and Vol had woken up by this point, and all 3 Volokci were now examining the igloo's walls with the intense focus of professional engineers encountering something completely new. "The construction technique," Marish said. "The way each block interlocks with the others without any adhesive or fastening mechanism. It is elegant in a way I did not expect from such primitive materials." Vol was already taking readings with a sensor device built into its suit. "I am documenting everything for transmission to our homeworld's engineering collective." because they will want to study this. They will want to understand how a species could develop such sophisticated construction techniques, using only frozen water and a cutting tool. Elena felt a strange mix of pride and amusement at the aliens' reactions to her. Building an igloo was simply something humans knew how to do, a skill that had been developed and refined over countless generations and passed down through teaching and practice. But to these beings, who came from worlds with different challenges and different solutions, it was apparently something revolutionary. The storm began to die at hour 32, the wind dropping from a howl to a whisper, and then to silence. Elena emerged from the igloo first, squinting against the sudden brightness of sunlight, reflecting off endless fields of white snow. The world had been transformed by the storm, familiar landmarks buried or reshaped. But Elena could still orient herself by the position of the sun and the general direction they had been traveling before. Everything went wrong. "We should continue toward the extraction beacon," she said as the others emerged from the shelter behind her. "Because we have lost time and we still have a long way to go." Desik stood beside her, the Morthanes feathers now dry and properly arranged, her body language showing none of the fear and desperation that had marked her during the storm. "Lead the way, Elena Vasquez," Desik said, "because I will follow wherever you go." The march to the extraction beacon took another 12 hours. But they were very different hours than the ones before the storm. The recruits moved in a tight formation with Elena at the center, and whenever anyone began to struggle, the others would gather around them and share body heat and encouragement until they could continue. Roth stayed close to Elena at all times, the Cathary-esque chemical glands constantly releasing signals that expressed trust and loyalty, and something that might have been the amphibian equivalent of love. The Morthani walked on either side of Roth, their feathers occasionally brushing against the human shoulders in what Elena had learned was a gesture of deep respect among their species. The Voloxi brought up the rear, their suits fully functional now that the temperature had risen to merely uncomfortable rather than deadly, their sensor arrays constantly scanning and recording everything that happened. When they finally reached the extraction beacon, they found Drill Commander Vethkan waiting for them with an expression on his scaled face that Elena could not quite read. 7 recruits departed, the Silurian said slowly. "And 7 recruits have arrived, which is not what I expected based on the storm conditions that were reported." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Elena. "I was preparing casualty reports when your life signs began registering on our sensors. And I must admit that I am curious how you managed to survive when every projection suggested that you should all be dead." Elena stepped forward and saluted in the human military fashion that the coalition had adopted as a standard gesture. "We encountered some weather, Commander, and we made appropriate adjustments." Vethkan's scales shifted color in a way that Elena had learned indicated surprise. "Appropriate adjustments," he repeated. "And what exactly did those adjustments involve?" Elena thought about everything that had happened. The fire she had created from methane deposits, the igloo she had built from snow and determination, the 6 alien lives she had saved through knowledge that her grandmother had given her decades ago. "I built a shelter, sir, and I made a fire, and we waited out the storm in relative comfort." The Silurian stared at her for a long moment. "You built a shelter and made a fire on ice world with no fuel sources and no construction materials?" "Yes, sir. Using only the contents of a standard survival kit." "Yes, sir. Although I should mention that I had 4 heating packs, not 3. So I had a spare." Vethkan made a sound that Elena's translator struggled to interpret, something that fell somewhere between a laugh and a growl of disbelief. "Get on the shuttle, all of you. And someone please explain to me in detail exactly what happened down there, on the shuttle ride back to the training station." The other recruits took turns telling Vethkan what Elena had done. each of them adding details that the others had missed or forgotten. Physic described the fire with words that made it sound like a miracle rather than basic chemistry. And Rekith spoke of the igloo as if it were a palace, rather than a simple dome of snow blocks. Frost chemical signals were so intense that the translator gave up entirely and simply displayed the message: extreme positive emotion beyond translation parameters. The Veluxi had already transmitted their documentation to their homeworld, and were receiving responses that suggested their engineering collective was very interested in learning more about human construction techniques. When they arrived at the training station, Vethkan pulled Elena aside for a private conversation. "I am recommending you for the Coalition's Hostile Environment Training Program," he said. "Not as a recruit, but as an instructor." Elena blinked in surprise. "An instructor?" "Sir, but I am just a sergeant, and I have only been with the Coalition for 6 months. Vethkan's scales shifted to a color that Elena had learned indicated amusement. "You are also apparently capable of creating fire and shelter from nothing on a world designed to kill you. And you saved 6 lives in conditions that should have been impossible to survive." He placed one of his clawed hands on her shoulder, a gesture of respect that Silurians rarely showed to members of other species. "The Coalition needs soldiers who can fight, but it also needs soldiers who can survive. And you have demonstrated that humans possess survival skills that no other species in the Coalition can match." Elena thought about her grandmother again, about the old woman who had taught her to see the cold not as an enemy, but as a challenge to be overcome. "I would be honored to teach others what I know." "Commander." Vethkan nodded and released her shoulder. "Then welcome to your new assignment, Instructor Vasquez. And may the Coalition's enemies tremble at what you will create." As Elena walked back to join her fellow recruits, Vesik caught her eye and made the Martheni gesture for family bond, a commitment that was not given lightly among her species. "Where you go, I will go," the avian said. "And what you teach, I will learn. Because you have shown me that survival's not about being born for a place, but about refusing to let any place defeat you." Elena smiled and returned the gesture as best she could with human hands. "Then let me teach you something my grandmother taught me," she said, "which is that the cold is not your enemy." Vesik tilted her head in curiosity. "What is the cold?" Then Elena looked out the viewport at the frozen surface of Cairo 7, at the world that had tried to kill them and failed. "The cold is just energy that you have not learned to argue with yet. Behind them." Vroth released a chemical signal that the translator rendered as understanding, and somewhere in the depths of space, the story of the human who made fire from ice and commanded the cold began to spread from species to species, from world to world, until it became a legend that would be told for generations. The legend said that when the universe tried to kill humans, humans simply refused to accept death as an option. The legend said that humans did not adapt to their environment, but forced their environment to adapt to them. The legend said that cold and heat and pressure and vacuum were not obstacles to humans, but merely problems to be solved. And the legend said that if you ever found yourself dying on a frozen world, you should pray that there was a human nearby, because humans had been fighting the cold since before they had names for the stars. And they had never once lost that fight. Elena Vasquez did not know that she had become a legend. She only knew that she had done what humans had always done. She had survived, and she had brought others with her.